Creators, how's it going? Welcome to another video. This one's gonna be real meta. Basically a few weeks ago, I decided to make myself a spreadsheet of every single video I've ever made. I have a database of all my reviews because I go back and look at them all the time. And I have all my YouTube scripts in a disjointed folder with most of the titles not matching up to the video titles, so I can't find any of them. Nor the video, like neither the video nor the script when I want to find it, and that bugged me. So I decided, why not make a nice little spreadsheet of everything I've ever done since my first educational videos release on January 19th of 2021. And what I discovered in going through all of them is how much the version of me on this channel used to be like 3 different people I looked up to, weirdly smushed together, and I spoke with a higher voice and it was really weird, and I'm glad that I've grown since then. But I also found some old videos that made me go, oh, I've changed since that video came out in more of an academic way, and more of a, maybe I should send that video over the Rainbow Bridge and try again, because oh man. The biggest offender, of course, being my second video of all time, lasting a whopping 5 minutes and 55 seconds, titled Female versus Male Autism. And I think there's a lot to be learned from like being okay with changing your mind or expanding your ideas as an academic, and there's a lot of merit in being able to go, wow, I said an ableist thing, or wow, I didn't understand the oppressive nature of the gender binary then, to oneself in the past, and not have that be a shame thing, and not have that be like something to be embarrassed about. And there's a small handful of good information in that video. I feel like most of it is salvageable. It just requires a whole lot of asterisks and side tangents. And I would also argue that like if we're gonna go through all my videos, I do have a few genuinely well-researched or well-told personal experience ones from winter to spring of 2021. The majority of them aren't great. Over the summer they improved a great deal, and then I studied abroad and they took an absolute nosedive because I didn't have time. January 22 to now is pretty solid. So if you want good more content to watch, I'm gonna leave most of those videos up because they're good conversation starters and aren't necessarily harmful, and I've already remade a couple of them since then. And I think showing growth is important as well, but I may add disclaimers to my first year of content. I haven't decided what I'm gonna do with that yet. If you have ideas, let me know. Anyway, the plan today is to watch through that old video, pause it a lot, and add things, expand on things, etc. And then once this is out, I will take down that video. No, that's a lie. This video is I already took down this video. And figure out where else I have cards referencing it and replace it with this one. Yeah, it's gonna be great. Also, video description for folks who need it. I am a white person with light brown shoulder length curly hair. I am wearing a white t-shirt and a light blue zip up hoodie, and I'm sitting in front of a plain wall with leaves on it. I thought about recreating the outfit from this video today, but I think it's funnier for me to be dressed masculine next to the hyper femme, younger, closeted version of myself. I still do hyper femme sometimes. It's different. The vibes are different. Also, I'm cozy right now. So this is what we're going with. Also, video description for the other video. I was wearing a red, green, and white plaid long sleeve dress with a collar and buttons down the center and sitting in front of a bookshelf. This is gonna be so awkward to watch and I hate it already. Okay, here we go. As you've probably heard, anytime you research autism, boys are 4 times more likely to be diagnosed with autism than girls, which, yeah, but that doesn't mean boys are 4 times more likely to have autism than girls. It just means that the diagnostic criteria is based on boys. I look dead inside. Oh my word. Now, sentiment here is correct. The numbers are incorrect. So the 4-to-1 ratio is talked about all the time. I still see it everywhere. It is everywhere. I did track down a meta-analysis from 2017 by Rachel Looms, Laura Hull, and William Palmier Lockmandy that says of children meeting criteria for ASD, the true male to female ratio is not 4-to-1, as is often assumed. Rather, it is closer to 3-to-1. There appears to be a diagnostic gender bias, meaning that girls who meet criteria for ASD are at disproportionate risk of not receiving a clinical diagnosis. So yes, but no. Also, the prevalence numbers of autism have been shifting, as have prevalences for many DSM diagnoses. In the last few years, we saw diagnostic expansion due to the pandemic. Not that more people have these experiences because of the pandemic, but because the DSM criteria are primarily focused on profiling different kinds of distress, which we obviously saw a lot of during the pandemic. And also because more people were forced to sit alone with their brains and realize how they were feeling, which led more people to seek help. Anyway, quick disclaimer. When I say boy and girl here, I acknowledge that I am working within the gender binary, which I don't particularly love. But that being said, medicine, diagnostic criteria, and the social norms that create them unfortunately tend to work within this binary, especially in the 1940s when this diagnosis was first created. Bear with me here. It technically wasn't first created in the 1940s, we're gonna get there, but I also directly contradict that statement in the next sentence, so I well knew that. So in 1908, Swiss scientist Paul-Eugen Bleuler coined the term autismus. It uses 2 Greek roots, autos meaning self and ismus meaning state of being. He called it this to reflect the somewhat withdrawn affect of his autistic patients. Before this term was created, and for a while after, autism was known as childhood schizophrenia.
It wasn't researched in depth until the 1940s.
That's kind of a generalization of early history, but it does get the job done. To clarify my wording a tad, Boyle used the word autistic to describe the symptom of being socially withdrawn and self-focused and seemingly disconnected from reality that he associated with some of the children he worked with who had childhood schizophrenia. I feel like I was so worried about potentially using outdated terms in this video and upsetting people that I ended up using words that were not like historically correct for the time period that I was describing, which made things harder to follow. Calling them autistic patients, that was confusing and convoluted. I'm sorry about that. I also want to touch on the it wasn't researched in depth till the 1940s thing. I learned after making that video about the story of a Jewish woman researcher in Russia in the 1920s who actually did what I would consider to be a better, at least more nuanced job of categorizing autistic experiences than what we got in the 40s, which we're going to touch on in just a moment. I made a video after her a few months after the video that we're watching came out, but to summarize and also to get some more depth here as well, because that video was also sort of not super in-depth. Grunya Efimovna Sukhareva, I hope I pronounced that right, was born in 1891 in Kiev, which was then a part of the Russian Empire. She got her medical degree in 1915 and worked as a psychiatrist there until she moved to Moscow in 1921, and there she created a school for mentally disabled children. She initially used autistic as a term much like Broila, but then began seeing lots of children she worked with who showed these traits, and these children were in her school for several years, so she got to work very closely with all of them, giving her the ability to research them more thoroughly. She eventually published her most major paper on this phenomenon in 1925. Her descriptions of the experiences of 6 boys under her care in this paper are remarkably similar to what we currently have in the DSM-5, which was published in 2013, acknowledging many of the things that the 2 guys we're about to talk about did not have in their criteria, such as sensory sensitivities. 2 years later, in 1927, she published another paper. This was about autism in young girls, which is based on 5 girls. She also mentioned potential brain differences related to autism, many of which are actually correct today. We now know that they're correct with neuroimaging, and she ended up publishing tons of papers, a few textbooks, some monographs, and founded several schools. She is one of the most well-known names in child psychiatry in Russia, and she died in 1981. Her 1925 paper was published in German in 1926, but was not translated into English until 70 years later.
Quick content warning here for Nazism, eugenics, and euthanasia. Feel free to skip to this time code if you need.
Different time code, obviously, but I'll put it here. But also, this is an important part of disability history, and I don't get super graphic, so maybe don't skip this, but you know yourself better than I do, so the option is always there.
So the first researcher was Hans Asperger, a pediatrician in Nazi Vienna who began giving talks in the late 1930s about his autistic psychopathy. He cited positive aspects of autism and called some of his patients absent-minded professors, though unfortunately in the majority of cases the positive aspects of autism do not outweigh the negative ones. Oi. His research was part of the Nazi effort to categorize people and eliminate the genetically unfit. He studied over 200 children, often for several months, and those he deemed unsalvageable were sent to Am Spiegelgrund, a child euthanasia clinic. Traits he called precocious in boys were seen as annoying in cries for attention in girls. He diagnosed many of the girls in his clinic with hysteria and/or hormone issues instead of his autistic psychopathy. All of his patients were white, and his final paper describing this condition only discussed 4 boys.
So in the past, I've had several people comment on various videos telling me that I'm wrong about Asperger, and my response is always like, I think it's a little bit more complicated than what I said here, but the emotions of this still stand. And it was one of the main reasons I planned to come back to this video, because people kept saying, no, Asperger was a good guy, I don't know what you're talking about. So I reread the research that I had done for this section. I understand where the narrative confusion does come from, but I am fairly correct in this, actually. Later in the video, I recommend 2 books, Neurotribes by Steve Silberman and Asperger's Children by Edith Schaeffer. I read both of them back to back over the course of a few days, as well as a 3rd book in a different key by John Donvan and Karen Zucker that I never mentioned here for some reason. And I got all of them intertwined with each other and mixed up and didn't realize the narrative complications between them. Otherwise, I would have pointed it out. So Neurotribes was released in 2015. It talks about Asperger as being pro-neurodiversity, as supportive of his patients, trying to tell the Nazi machine that they were useful, and used his diagnostics to help save their lives rather than send them to certain death in the eugenicist war machine. He was some sort of hero who happened to be involved with the Nazi Party, sure, but he was actively working against them and saving the autistic patients that he was taking care of. This narrative seems to have been around before this book came out as well, kind of the colloquial understanding of this guy. In a different key came along 2 years later in 2017, where they cited a scholar by the name of Herwig Czech, sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly as well, who went to Vienna's municipal archives and found a lot of information that completely contradicted the savior narrative. Neurotribes updated the paperback edition later on to account for these changes. I don't remember which edition I read. Truly can't even tell you if I borrowed the literal library book or listened to the audiobook. I don't remember. But both of these books are a wider history of autism in general, with small pieces about Asperger himself. And then in 2018 we got Asperger's Children, which is specifically about the child euthanasia program in the Reich. And also came at it from a very fair historian angle, and she talked a lot about the social pressures of what it was like for these parents of the disabled children and for people caught up in everything going on, but at the same time also very fairly called out complicity and balanced those two nicely against each other. To quote her, Asperger was neither a zealous supporter nor an opponent of the regime. He was an exemplar of this drift into complicity, part of the muddled majority of the populace who alternately conformed, concurred, feared, normalized, minimized, repressed, and reconciled themselves to Nazi rule. So while he never technically joined the Nazi Party, most of his friends and his colleagues were Nazis and deliberately forwarding eugenicist rhetoric. He was also involved in many other organizations directly affiliated with the party and its ideals, and there is a file vouching for his loyalty within the party despite not being a part of it. We also know that he was involved in at least 44 children's transfers to Spiegelgrund, and at least 2 of which he personally transferred. I will also mention that some of what Czech unearthed that we see in Asperger's Children is how in his early work he was unsure about the ethics of categorizing children, but the further into the war that they got, the more he began to categorize children, and then the more he began to categorize them in deliberately derogatory ways, at one point specifically saying they were outside the greater organism of what the Nazis wanted, and often describing them more harshly than physicians from Spiegelgrund would. So it's not like he was trying to necessarily fit in with his derogatory language toward the patients, because other people were not doing what he was doing. After the war, he told everybody he was anti-Nazi. He thought that Spiegelgrund was totally inhuman. But I also think that a lot of people said that after the war, and maybe even believed them because they were so horrified by what they had been involved in. But that does not mean he didn't do all the things that we have significant record of him doing. So at the very least, he was deeply complicit. And whether he meant for his research to be used to categorize in a eugenicist manner or not, that's what it was used for, and he didn't stop it. In regards to Grunia, who we spoke about earlier, it is more than likely that Asperger had not only read her work in German, but had been inspired by it and then did not cite her, but also she was a Jewish woman living in the USSR, and he was a Catholic man living in Vienna, Nazi-occupied Vienna. So I think we can maybe connect the dots as to why he just stole her work without crediting her. Like, whether he was against any and all of those identity markers or not, most of his Nazi colleagues probably were, and basing his work on that of a Jewish woman living in a communist country would discredit his research in their eyes, so he did not have much motivation for academic honesty there. There were also 2 Jewish doctors who are important here as well, George Frankl and Annie Weiss, who worked in a Vienna clinic in the early 1930s and discussed very similar traits in their patients. Their writing does not include the word autistic explicitly, but they may have spoken about it conversationally, we don't know, and they also may have read Grunia's writings. Frankl became the senior psychiatrist of the clinic in 1932, and at the same time a young Hans Asperger began working in the same clinic. When the Reich wanted to oust all Jewish doctors, Weiss went to the US to work at Columbia University, and she had help from a man named Leo Kanner at Johns Hopkins, who helped around 200 Jewish doctors escape Europe during the war to bring Frankl to the US. Frankl and Weiss got married after this, which I think is adorable. After his arrival, Frankl worked with Kanner at Johns Hopkins. In 1943, they each published a paper in the journal Nervous Child, both focused on communication difficulties in young children, but crucially, the 2 papers bore different titles. Frankl's work was Language and Affective Contact, whereas Kanner's was Autistic Disturbances of Affective Contact. And let's see who I talk about next in this video of mine.
At the same time, in the US, there was a scientist named Leo Kanner who did his research at Johns Hopkins and coined the term infantile autism. He studied 3 girls and 8 boys, all but 2 of which were of Anglo-Saxon descent. He created the idea of refrigerator mothers, the idea that though some autistic traits are innate from birth, most of it is the result of parents not loving their children enough. This then led a psychologist by the name of Bruno Bettelheim to separate autistic kids from their parents in following years.
He didn't create the precise term of refrigerator mothers using the specific terminology. He came up with the vague concept. Bettelheim created the term in 1950. It was not debunked until the late 1970s.
People thought for a while that this was an odd case of 2 scientists discovering the same thing in 2 separate places at the same time, though it turns out that Kanner knew of Asperger's work and simply didn't cite it, so it was lost from autism research until the 1980s. If you want to read a deeply upsetting but also incredible book about autism history, I highly recommend Neurotribes by Steve Silberman, as well as Asperger's Children by Edith Schaeffer.
You know, academic dishonesty is really bad, don't get me wrong, but given the fact that Kanner was an Austrian-Hungarian Jew and spent a lot of time and energy trying to save tons of Jewish doctors from the specific regime that Asperger worked under, and the fact that he worked closely with the two people who came up with the theories Asperger probably stole from, and the fact that those two people knew Asperger personally, ooh, that was an accent as well, personally, and could vouch for whether he was a defensible dude or not, I think I'm gonna say that I'm kind of chill with kind of not citing Asperger here. Like, from an academic perspective, the wrong thing to say, but from a deeply petty personal perspective, I support him. I still think you should have cited Frankel and Weiss because they definitely worked together on all of this, though I haven't actually seen the paper in a long time, so I don't precisely know. They could have been, like, co-writers or involved on there. Also, he probably should have cited Grunia if he'd read her stuff. It's, again, very likely that Frankel and Weiss read her stuff. They very well could have read it a long time ago, forgotten about it, and couldn't find it to source properly, and they wanted to source it, but with the war they couldn't. It's not like they had Google like we do today. I also want to add that Kana's case 1, aka the first person to be diagnosed as autistic ever, was a man by the name of Donald Triplett. He passed away in June at the age of 89.
Anyway, as you can see by the way the diagnostic criteria was created, it's biased against people assigned female at birth, people of color, teens, adults, and literally any other minority you can think of. I mean, based on the history, it's no wonder boys are diagnosed 4 times as much. People assigned male at birth also tend to express their autistic traits differently from those assigned female at birth. It's unclear how much of this is due to societal norms and perceptions and how much is due to genetic factors, but it is definitely a good mix of the two. I mean, stereotypically, women socialize differently than men and focus on more subtle social cues, and this has been corroborated through research. Some scientists estimate that an autistic person assigned as female is at the same social level of a neurotypical person assigned as male. Many scientists have also proposed that autistic people assigned female at birth are significantly better at masking and mimicry than autistic males. We also have a slight differentiation in how we show our symptoms, which leads us to be misdiagnosed with a plethora of mental illnesses and personality disorders instead of the underlying autism.
Sorry, I just blue screened. Okay, I opened that video saying the gender binary is reductive, and then here I am reducing traits into the gender binary. Wow. I will say, around the time of writing this video, autism in girls was a highly trending thing, so I was sort of on brand with a lot of the community, but that does not mean that it is a thing that I agree with or want to keep perpetuating. I would also like to note that I said symptoms when traits is the more appropriate word choice there. So some of the research I state in this section is true. However, I also find that research to be a bit reductive, so let's expand on that a bit. By dismantling the concept of gender socialization, or that the gender assigned at birth fundamentally affects how you interact with the world. Step 1. There's no fundamentally statistically significant difference between male and female brains. We know this, there's been significant research into this for about a decade and a half. I have a video about it up here that you can check out. It's not a thing. So from a purely biological perspective, society excluded, presentation of autism should not be gender specific, as it is a neurodevelopmental condition, and there's no significant difference between male and female brains. Step 2 is that there is no universal AFAB assigned female at birth or AMAB assigned male at birth experience. A little boy who really likes to play with dolls is going to have a very different experience from the little boy who likes to play with trucks because of how they're going to be treated because of that behavior. A girl who really likes to play princess is going to be treated differently from the girl who's always covered in mud and up a tree and begging for a crew cut. How you interact with the world affects how people interact with you, regardless of what gender you are assigned. Children who conform to gender norms are rewarded for being easy to understand. Those of us who flout gendered expectations are punished, excluded, and ignored. There's this assumption that every person who was assigned female at birth was undermined, disbelieved, talked over, deprioritized, and physically intruded upon throughout their whole lives, and that everyone who was assigned male at birth was believed, heard, valued, and rewarded for their brilliance. Socialization is also something that you pay attention to. Regardless of gender, kids learn growing up on Thanksgiving that the women do the dishes while the boys go watch the game. They learn that the girl who raises her hand to answer every question in class is going to be an annoying, bossy know-it-all who should be quiet, and that the boy in the playground who cried when he skinned his knee is weak because boys don't cry. We've seen all of it. Socialization is also really fluid. It's ever-changing based on your environment, and it doesn't end or lock in when you turn 18. We're always adapting to our surroundings and our circumstances, and we change things very quickly. And we also forget that we've changed quickly. Kind of like me watching this video from 3 years ago here and being like, who the heck was that? I don't remember what my specific mindset at the time was, or how I interacted with my environment and how it treated me back. I don't really remember that. I'm very sure that it is different because I interact with my world very differently now. And I also learned while researching this via Dr. Devon Price, because he's fantastic and we always love platforming him whenever we can. The idea of female socialization is a really common thing that TERFs use to say that trans women aren't real women because they don't get the sexist depression that comes along with girlhood. So that's also a thing. Yes, how we are treated does impact how we interact with the world. But that is not limited to our assigned gender at birth or our perceived gender. It also involves our race, our class, our ability, our age, our culture, who we hang out with, how we speak, everything else. It is intersectional and complicated and cannot ever and will not ever be able to be boiled down to just assigned female at birth and assigned male at birth, or socialized as a girl and socialized as a boy, because that is just not how people work and not how society works. And there's also something to be said about the fact that people being like, I'm AFAB non-binary as an identity became a thing for a while, which is just like trading in one binary for another binary. I never understood that. So when it comes to the whole autism in girls traits I pointed out here, these traits are just underdiagnosed autistic traits. Period. And they're ones that we see in all kinds of people. Yes, the fact that the criteria was based on a small handful of white boys is going to impact who gets diagnosed because we perceive identical behaviors differently in different kinds of bodies, but also because our entire psychiatric system was built on racism and misogyny and general colonialism. We're talking about that. When are we talking about that? We're talking about that soon. Let's find out when we're talking about that. It was either last week or it's going to be next week. It was last week. We talked about it last week. So you can watch the video about it up here. But the idea of this is girl autism and this is boy autism is, it's not fundamentally entirely incorrect, but it is woefully misguided, reductive, and ultimately not super helpful. In regards to what I said on misdiagnosis, there are common things that autistic women and people of color get misdiagnosed with, the major one being borderline personality disorder, BPD. But there are also many diagnoses in the DSM that have sort of two sides of the same coin, and primarily women get one diagnosis and primarily men get the other just due to stigma, or ones where primarily white people get one diagnosis and primarily people of color get the other, again due to stigma. But to say that they're entirely in either category almost exclusively is reductionist, because many people will end up presenting in ways that do not align to which group makes up the majority of a diagnostic group. And the idea of a male stereotype of autism is just the stereotype of autism. Period. That we usually only see represented by white men, which is also not an autism exclusive thing. Now that reviewing media is part of my job, the vast majority of disability representation that we get is portrayed by white men, unless the disability can be sexualized, in which case it is portrayed by white women. We don't get anything else. Disabled people of color do not exist in media very often. And if none of this gender stuff made sense, that's fine. I got really heated about it, so I didn't explain it very well. I'm gonna include all these things I read about in my sources below, but basically binaries are unhelpful and reductionist and also not how the world works and not how people work, and everything is way more complicated and nuanced and intersectional than that, and the whole autism in girls trend should have just been a underdiagnosed autistic traits trend instead, because those things appear in all kinds of people who all deserve to be able to feel represented within our community. Actually, the icon that is at Rivera Bonbon on the social medias posted a video about that the other day, so let's throw that in here as well.
Having boobs does not change your autism.
Nice booby trap.
There's this common belief within the autistic community that there is boy autism and girl autism. There is an inherent way in which boys present and an inherent way in which girls present. And this is largely inaccurate.
You're the worst kind of autistic.
For one, the vocabulary in which we're using to describe this phenomenon is incorrect. Autism presentation involves what symptoms of autism you present. This is regardless of masking capabilities. Factoring in masking, autistic women do have a lot of shared experience, but that does not mean that autistic women have a singular presentation of autism that is different than boys. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, wow, Ricky, you don't know what you're talking about. Why would girls get misdiagnosed so often if there wasn't a different way that girls present? Have you ever heard of sexism?
Women are stupid and I don't respect them.
The reason that girls are not diagnosed with autism is not because girls have a different presentation of autism that psychologists don't understand. It's that even when they do have that stereotypically boy autism, they're still ignored. And the same goes especially for autistic women of color. People forget how deep racism and sexism are in the psychiatric community. Autistic women aren't misdiagnosed because we're inherently different. It's just because they hate us.
Can't believe this country hates women more than it loves guns.
Okay, back to this video.
Doctors are also not trained to recognize autistic traits in adults, and they are often much harder to spot since by that point, adults have had a lot of time to learn to mask, even without realizing it. In the way diagnoses are taught in schools, the only autism examples and criteria they see are the stereotypes created in the 1940s mixed with personal biases and misinformation spread by hate groups such as Autism Speaks. So many practicing clinicians still believe that autism is less prevalent in girls, if not fully impossible.
I mean, yes, but I would also argue that many doctors in general are not trained in autism at all. Like, most psych programs have a week or less discussing autism. So the majority of education that practitioners are getting on the matter is from things that they Google, from their TikTok feed, and from whatever media they consume. And if they like to watch like shows like ER and House MD and The Good Doctor, we're screwed. Like, that's it. Which is objectively both a bigger and more fixable problem. When I took Abnormal Psych, I think they've changed that name since I took it a couple years ago, but anyway, when I took Abnormal Psych in college, we talked about autism for one class, and then I offered with a few friends to give a presentation on it as our final, and our professor, the one teaching Abnormal Psych, said she didn't know 90% of what we talked about in our presentation. And I promise you that we were not covering obscure things. This was like normal basic information, which honestly, that moment radicalized me more than any other moment to my education, except maybe the whole like the theater isn't made for people like you debacle, but like when it comes to the psychology side, that was the moment I lost faith in the system altogether.
On top of that, there is the systemic issue of medical care being expensive and having long wait lists, which blocks a lot of people from being able to go.
They're also not typically covered by insurance. I would also add that it's not just that it blocks people from being able to go get a diagnosis, but also that based on minority status, they may be less likely to receive said diagnosis while they're there, so literally what is the point of dropping the money? Especially if the goal is to just know if they're autistic, because diagnoses are great for getting you accommodations in school and at work if you need them, but they can also impact your ability to immigrate in some places, your ability to get gender-affirming care, automatic denial from entry into the military, which for some people is the only way they can afford an education. We can lose autonomy over our own health, a great example being the way COVID triages were created in the 20s, oh my gosh, in 2020. You're also more likely to lose custody of your children, etc. I have a video about this up here if you want to check it out. I'm not saying this to scare anybody out of a diagnosis, but to provide wider context.
Autistic people are also statistically much more likely to be queer and trans than neurotypical people, which adds on another layer of discrimination. And because the media portrays autistic people to be a straight white boy who wears a specific zip-up hoodie and likes trains, people have a hard time realizing they're autistic. Okay, seriously, what's up with the hoodie? I also wore one as a kid, but that's beside the point. This was too easy to find.
I swear I didn't plan this. I scripted this video and I forgot about that piece of it, and then I wore... I ironically bought the sweatshirt because I thought it was funny and also because we needed it for Curious Incident, but then it became my favorite clothing piece ever and I wear it all the time and it's a problem. So maybe some stereotypes have a point. But still, I think that our media is getting slightly better in the few years since making that video. Not exponentially, but a good deal. But yeah, that's all I got for you. I recommended some deeply outdated resources at the end of this, and nobody needs to see that. So ignore those. I did include all the sources I talked about today in the description as always. I also always have autism resources made by me linked to the bottom of my description. And yeah, I hope you learned something from this. I definitely did. I hope that you had a good time. I hope this helps show the fact that you can always change your mind and you can learn and you can grow, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's part of the scientific process and part of being a human being. It's been really wild looking back and fun. And also my audience has grown a lot. Wild. Hi, thanks for being here. Anyway, closing out the video. As always, thank you for listening. Thank you for learning. Remember, it's never too late to start over, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.